The history of economic thought deals with different thinkers and theories in the subject that became political economy and economics. From the ancient world to the present day, it encompasses many disparate schools of economic thought. Ancient Greek writers such as the philosopher Aristotle examined ideas about the art of wealth acquisition, and questioned whether property is best left in private or public hands. In medieval times, scholastics such as Thomas Aquinas argued that it was a moral obligation of businesses to sell goods at a just price. In the Western world, economics was not a separate discipline, but part of philosophy until the 18th–19th century Industrial Revolution and the 19th century Great Divergence, which accelerated economic growth. Long before that, from the Renaissance at least, economics as an intellectual discipline or science was dominated by Western thinkers and their academic institutions, schooling economists from outside the West, although there are isolated instances in other societies. Ancient economic thought. Key people: Fan Li, Qin Huang, Wang Anshi, Mahavira, Chanakya, Xenophon, Aristotle and Plato. China: Fan Li, an advisor to King Guzhan of Yu, wrote on economic issues and developed a set of golden business rules. India: Chanakya wrote the Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft, economic policy and military strategy. Greco-Roman world: Ancient Athens was a slave-based society, but also developed an embryonic model of democracy. Xenophon's O Economicus is a dialogue, principally about household management and agriculture. Plato's dialogue The Republic described an ideal city-state run by philosopher kings and contained references to specialization of labor and production. Plato was the first to advocate the credit theory of money, that is, money as a unit of account for debt. Aristotle's Politics analyzed different forms of the state: monarchy, aristocracy, constitutional government, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy as a critique of Plato's model of a philosopher kings. Of particular interest for economists is Plato's blueprint of a society based on common ownership of resources. Aristotle viewed this model as an oligarchical anathema. Though Aristotle did certainly advocate that many things be held in common, he argued that not everything could be, simply because of the wickedness of human nature. It is clearly better that property should be private, wrote Aristotle, but the use of it common, and the special business of the legislator is to create in men this benevolent disposition. In Politics, Book 1, Aristotle discusses the general nature of households and market exchanges. For him there is a certain art of acquisition, or wealth-getting, but because it is the same many people are obsessed with its accumulation. And wealth-getting, for one's household is necessary and honorable, while exchange on the retail trade for simple accumulation is justly censured, for it is dishonorable. Of the people he stated they as a whole thought acquisition of wealth as being either the same as, or a principle of oikonomia, with oikos as house and nomos in fact translated as custom or law. Aristotle himself highly disapproved of usury and cast scorn on making money through a monopoly. Aristotle discarded Plato's credit theory of money for metallism, the theory that money derives its value from the purchasing power of the commodity upon which it is based, and is only an instrument, its sole purpose being a medium of exchange, which means on its own, it is worthless, not useful as a means to any of the necessities of life. Economic thought in the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas was an Italian theologian and economic writer. He taught in both Cologne and Paris, and was part of a group of Catholic scholars known as the Schoolmen, who moved their inquiries beyond theology to philosophical and scientific debates. In the treatise Summa Theologica, Aquinas dealt with the concept of a just price, which he considered necessary for the reproduction of the social order. Similar in many ways to the modern concept of long-run equilibrium, a just price was just sufficient to cover the costs of production, including the maintenance of a worker and his family. Aquinas argued it was immoral for sellers to raise their prices simply because buyers had a pressing need for a product. Aquinas discusses a number of topics in the format of questions and replies, substantial tracts dealing with Aristotle's theory. Questions 77 and 78 concern economic issues, primarily what a just price might be, and the fairness of a seller dispensing faulty goods. Aquinas argued against any form of cheating and recommended always paying compensation in lieu of good service. Whilst human laws might not impose sanctions for unfair dealing, divine law did, in his opinion. Duns Scotus. One of Aquinas' main critics was Duns Scotus, originally from Duns, Scotland, who taught in Oxford, Cologne, and Paris. In his work Sententuary, he thought it possible to be more precise than Aquinas in calculating a just price, emphasizing the costs of labor and expenses. Although he recognized that the latter might be inflated by exaggeration because buyer and seller usually have different ideas of a just price. If people did not benefit from a transaction, in Scotus' view, they would not trade. Scotus said merchants perform a necessary and useful social role by transporting goods and making them available to the public. Jean Buridan was a French priest. Buridanus looked at money from two angles: its metal value and its purchasing power, which he acknowledged can vary. He argued that aggregated, not individual, demand and supply determine market prices. Hence, for him a just price was what the society collectively and not just one individual is willing to pay. Ibn Khaldun until Joseph J. Spangler's 1964 work, Economic Thought of Islam. Ibn Khaldun, Adam Smith, was considered the father of economics. Now there is a second candidate, Arab-Muslim scholar Ibn Khaldun of Tunisia, although how the Muslim world fell behind the West, or what influence Khaldun had in the West, is unclear. Arthur Toynbee called Ibn Khaldun a genius, who appears to have been inspired by no predecessors and to have found no kindred souls among his contemporaries. And yet, in the prolegomena to his universal history, he has conceived and formulated a philosophy of history which is undoubtedly the greatest work of its kind that has ever yet been created by any mind in any time or place. Ibn Khaldun expressed a theory of the life cycle of civilizations, the specialization of labor, and the value of money as a means of exchange rather than as a store of inherent value. His ideas on taxes bore a striking resemblance to supply-side economics' Laffer curve, which posits that beyond a certain point higher taxes discourage production and actually cause revenues to fall. Nicole Orsma, French philosopher and priest Nicolas Orsma, wrote De Origine, Natura, Juriae Mutationibus Monetarum, about the origin, nature, law, and alterations of money. It is one of the earliest manuscripts on the concept of money. Antonin of Florence. Saint Antoninus of Florence, O.P., was an Italian Dominican friar, who became Archbishop of Florence. Antoninus' writings addressed social and economic development, and argued that the state has a duty to intervene in mercantile affairs for the common good, and an obligation to help the poor and needy. In his primary work, Summa Theologica, he was mainly concerned about price, justice and capital theory. Like Duns Scotus, he distinguishes between the natural value of a good and its practical value. The latter is determined by its suitability to satisfy needs, its rarity and its subjective value. Due to this subjective component, there can not only be one just price, but a bandwidth of more or less just prices. Mercantilism and international trade. Key people: Victor de Riqueta, Marquis de Mirabeau, Jean Baudin, Nicolaus Copernicus, Edward Selden, Gerard Malinige, Thomas Mann, William Petty, Philip von Hornik, Charles Davenant, Josiah Child, Jean-Baptiste Kolbert, Pierre Le Peasant, Sieur de Bois Gilbert, Sir James Stewart and Leonardus Lasius. Mercantilism dominated Europe from the 16th to the 18th century. Despite the localism of the Middle Ages, the waning of feudalism saw new national economic frameworks begin to strengthen. After the voyages of Christopher Columbus and other explorers opened up new opportunities for trade with the New World and Asia, newly powerful monarchies wanted a more powerful military state to boost their status. Mercantilism was a political movement and an economic theory that advocated the use of the state's military power to ensure that local markets and supply sources were protected, spawning protectionism. Mercantile theorists held that international trade could not benefit all countries at the same time. Money and precious metals were the only source of riches in their view, and limited resources must be allocated between countries. Therefore, tariffs should be used to encourage exports, which bring money into the country, and discourage imports, which send it abroad. In other words, a positive balance of trade ought to be maintained through a surplus of exports, often backed by military might. Despite the prevalence of the model, the term mercantilism was not coined until 1763, by Victor de Riqueta, Marquis de Mirabeau, and popularized by Adam Smith in 1776, who vigorously opposed it. School of Salamanca. In the 16th century, the Jesuit school of Salamanca in Spain developed economic theory to a high level, only to have their contributions forgotten until the 20th century. Sir Thomas More. In 1516, English humanist Sir Thomas More published Utopia, which describes an ideal society where land is owned in common and there is universal education and religious tolerance, inspiring the English Poor Laws and the communism-socialism movement. Nicolaus Copernicus. In 1517, Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus published the first known argument for the quantity theory of money. In 1519 he also published the first known form of Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good. Jean Bodin. In 1568, Jean Bodin of France published Reply to Malestroit, containing the first known analysis of inflation, which he claimed was caused by importation of gold and silver from South America, backing the quantity theory of money. Barthélemy de Lafermasse. In 1598, French mercantilist economist Barthélemy de Lafermasse published Les Trésors et Richesses pour mettre l'État en splendeur, which blasted those who frowned on French silks because the industry created employment for the poor. The first known mention of underconsumption theory, which was later refined by John Maynard Keynes. Leonardus Lasius. In 1605, Flemish Jesuit theologian Leonardus Lasius published On Justice and Law, the deepest moral theological study of economics since Aquinas, whose just price approach he claimed was no longer workable. Edward Miss Selden and Gerard Malinege. In 1622, English merchants Edward Miss Selden and Gerard Malinege began a dispute over free trade and the desirability of government regulation of companies, with Malinege arguing against foreign exchanges under the control of bankers, and Miss Selden arguing that international money exchange and fluctuations in the exchange rate depend upon international trade and not bankers, and that the state should regulate trade to ensure export surpluses. Thomas Mann. English economist Thomas Mann describes early mercantilist policy in his book England's Treasure by Foreign Trade, which was not published until 1664, although it was widely circulated in manuscript form during his lifetime. A member of the East India Company, he wrote about his experiences in A Discourse of Trade from England unto the East Indies. According to Mann, trade was the only way to increase England's wealth, and he suggested several courses of action. Important were frugal consumption to increase the amount of goods available for export, increased use of land and other natural resources to reduce import requirements, lower export duties on goods produced domestically from foreign materials, and the export of goods with an elastic demand because more money could be made from higher prices. Sir William Petty. In 1662, English economist Sir William Petty began publishing short works applying the rational scientific tradition of Francis Bacon to economics. requiring that it only use measurable phenomena and seek quantitative precision, coining the term political arithmetic, introducing statistical mathematics, and becoming the first scientific economist. Philipp von Hornik. Philipp von Hornik was born in Frankfurt and became an Austrian civil servant, writing in a time when his country was constantly threatened by Ottoman invasion. In Österreich über alles was nur will, he laid out one of the clearest statements of mercantile policy, listing 9 principal rules of national economy: to inspect the country's soil with the greatest care, and not to leave the agricultural possibilities of a single corner or clod of earth unconsidered. All commodities found in a country, which cannot be used in their natural state, should be worked up within the country. Attention should be given to the population, that it may be as large as the country can support. Gold and silver once in the country are under no circumstances to be taken out for any purpose. The inhabitants should make every effort to get along with their domestic products. Foreign commodities should be obtained not for gold or silver, but in exchange for other domestic wares, and should be imported in unfinished form, and worked up within the country. Opportunities should be sought night and day for selling the country's superfluous goods to these foreigners in manufactured form. No importation should be allowed under any circumstances of which there is a sufficient supply of suitable quality at home. Nationalism, self-sufficiency and national power were the basic policies proposed. Jean-Baptiste Kolbert and Pierre Le Peasant. Sieur de Bois-Guilbert in 1665–1683. Jean-Baptiste Kolbert was Minister of Finance under King Louis XIV of France, and set up national guilds to regulate major industries. Silk, linen, tapestry, furniture manufacture and wine were examples of the crafts in which France specialized, all of which came to require membership in a guild to operate in until the French Revolution. According to Kolbert, it is simply and solely the abundance of money within a state which makes the difference in its grandeur and power. In 1695, French economist Pierre Le Peasant, Sieur de Bois-Guilbert wrote a plea to Louis XIV to end Kolbert's mercantilist program, containing the first notion of an economical market, becoming the first economist to question mercantile economic policy and value the wealth of a country by its production and exchange of goods instead its assets. Charles Davenant in 1696, British mercantilist Tory Member of Parliament Charles Davenant published Essay on the East India Trade, displaying the first understanding of consumer demand in perfect competition. Sir James Stewart in 1767, Scottish mercantilist economist Sir James Stewart published an inquiry into the principles of political economy, the first book in English with the term political economy in the title, and the first complete economics treatise.